He promised never to touch her, but one night was enough to make him break his own rules. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. The 72nd floor of the Caldwell Tower pierced through the morning fog like a steel sentinel. Inside his office, Samuel Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city below with the detached interest of someone observing ants through glass. His reflection stared back at him. Impeccable charcoal suit, precisely trimmed dark hair, and eyes that hadn't softened in years. "Mr. Caldwell?" His intercom crackled with his secretary's voice. "The candidates for the personal assistant position are here." Samuel pressed the intercom button without moving his gaze from the window. "Send them in, one at a time, Clara. 15 minutes each." He had gone through 4 personal assistants in the past year. None had lasted more than 3 months. It wasn't that they were incompetent. He hired only the best, but they all eventually made the same mistake. They tried to get personal. The first candidate entered with rehearsed confidence. Samuel didn't bother turning around immediately. He let them steep in the silence, in the power dynamic that his position at the window created. It was a test, like everything else in his life. "Mr. Caldwell." The voice that broke the silence was steady, neither timid nor overly familiar. "I'm Charlotte Hayes." Something in her tone made him turn. Charlotte Hayes stood in the center of his office, her posture relaxed but professional. She wore a simple navy blazer and pencil skirt, her honey-blonde hair pulled back in a neat chignon. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, clear, direct, and unintimidated. "You're younger than your resume suggested," he said, moving to his desk. "My experience speaks for itself," she replied, without a hint of defensiveness. "Though, I notice you're younger than most CEOs of Fortune 500 companies." Samuel's eyebrow ticked up slightly. Most candidates wouldn't dare such an observation. He picked up her resume, though he'd already memorized it. Harvard Business School, top of your class, 2 years at Goldman Sachs, then a personal assistant to the CEO of Reed Enterprises. He looked up. "Why leave Reed?" "Because I don't believe in staying where I'm not challenged." Charlotte met his gaze. "Reed was comfortable. I'm not interested in comfortable." Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "This position has strict requirements, the first being absolute discretion, the second—" He paused, making sure she was paying attention. "Professional boundaries are to be maintained at all times. There is no room for personal relationships or emotional attachments in business." Most candidates nodded eagerly at this point. Charlotte didn't. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. "With all due respect, Mr. Caldwell, I'm here to be exceptional at my job, not to make friends. I understand boundaries perfectly well." For the briefest moment, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years during these interviews. Interest. Not attraction. He'd buried that capability long ago, but a spark of professional curiosity. "The position requires international travel," he continued, "often with little notice. Your life would revolve around my schedule." "I assumed as much," Charlotte replied. "I've already arranged flexible lease terms on my apartment and have no commitments that would interfere with travel requirements." Samuel stood, walking around his desk. He stopped a precise distance from her, close enough to be slightly intimidating, far enough to maintain his rule about physical proximity. "Why should I hire you, Ms. Hayes?" Charlotte didn't step back. "Because I'm not here to impress you. Mr. Caldwell, I'm here to excel at this job, and because I suspect you've gone through enough assistance to know the difference between someone who wants to climb the corporate ladder and someone who wants to master their role." She paused, then added, "Also, I make excellent coffee." The ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips before he could stop it. He turned away immediately, moving back to his desk. "Clara will show you out. We'll be in touch." After she left, Samuel, stood at his window again, his reflection now accompanied by a faint frown. Charlotte Hayes was competent, professional, and clearly intelligent. She would be perfect for the position, and that was precisely what worried him, because for the first time in years he'd felt something crack in his carefully constructed walls. It was microscopic, barely a hairline fracture. But Samuel hadn't built his empire by ignoring warning signs. He pressed the intercom. Clara cancelled the remaining interviews. He paused, his jaw tightening. And prepare an offer letter for Ms. Hayes. Sometimes the best defense was to face a threat head-on. He would hire Charlotte Hayes, and he would prove to himself that she was just another employee. Nothing more. After all, his rules had kept him safe for 15 years. No one had come close to breaking them. No one ever would. 3 weeks into her new position, Charlotte Hayes had learned 2 things about Samuel Caldwell. First, he operated with the precision of an atomic clock. Second, his infamous no-touch rule wasn't just a quirk, it was an obsession. She watched from her adjoining office as he methodically sanitized his hands after a board meeting. The ritual was always the same. 2 pumps of sanitizer, exactly 20 seconds of rubbing, followed by a subtle adjustment of his cuffs. It wasn't about germophobia. She'd seen him touch doorknobs and elevator buttons without hesitation. No, this was about washing away the lingering sensation of mandatory handshakes. "The Anderson contract needs your signature," Charlotte said, entering his office with a leather portfolio. She'd mastered the art of maintaining exactly 6 feet of distance, having noticed how he tensed when people came too close. Samuel looked up from his computer, his dark eyes unreadable. "Did legal review the amendments?" "Twice. I had them pay special attention to Clause 7. Charlotte placed the portfolio at the corner of his desk, his preferred spot for document exchanges. "I also took the liberty of highlighting the changes they made to the non-compete section." A slight nod was his only acknowledgement, but Charlotte had learned to read his micro-expressions. The barely perceptible relaxation of his jaw meant she'd exceeded expectations. Again. "Your dinner with the Japanese investors is confirmed for 8, she continued, maintaining her position by the sleek conference table. "I've arranged for private dining at Nobu, upper level, corner table with its own entrance. No press, no other diners within 20 feet. This time, Samuel's eyebrow ticked up slightly. He'd never specified his seating preferences at restaurants, but she'd noticed his tension during crowded business dinners. "Thorough," he murmured, signing the contract with his Mont Blanc pen, the one he never let anyone else touch. "I also moved tomorrow's morning meetings to video conference," Charlotte added. "The weather forecast shows severe thunderstorms, and I know how you prefer to avoid physical meetings during inclement weather." Samuel's pen paused mid-signature. He looked up, his expression sharpening. "You've been studying my preferences." "It's my job to anticipate your needs, Mr. Caldwell." Charlotte met his gaze steadily. "The more efficient I am, the more successful you can be." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. "And what else have you anticipated about me, Ms. Hayes?" Charlotte considered her next words carefully. "That you value competence over compliance, that you prefer solutions over excuses, and that your boundaries aren't arbitrary. They're fundamental to how you operate." Samuel stood slowly, and for a moment the air in the office seemed to thicken. He walked to the window, his favorite retreat when conversations turned too personal. "You analyze everything, don't you?" "Says the man who counts the steps between his desk and the door," Charlotte replied, then immediately wondered if she'd gone too far. But instead of the cold dismissal she half expected, Samuel turned slightly, and Charlotte caught something that almost looked like amusement in his reflection. 57, he said quietly. "Pardon?" "Steps. From my desk to the door. You're right. I count them. He turned fully now, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Most people either ignore my boundaries or tiptoe around them apologetically. You've chosen to understand them instead. Why? Charlotte felt the weight of his question, the layers beneath it. Because understanding isn't the same as trying to change something or someone. The silence that followed was electric. Samuel's expression remained impassive, but Charlotte saw his hands flex slightly at his sides. A tell she'd noticed happened only when he was processing something unexpected. Finally, he spoke. The Boston acquisition meeting is next week. 3 days at the Stonebrook Resort. Make sure they book us separate wings of the building. Already done, Charlotte replied. You're in the East Wing, corner suite. I'm in the West. Maximum working efficiency, minimum proximity. Samuel nodded, returning to his desk. But as he passed the conference table, he was closer to her than he'd ever allowed himself to be. Close enough that Charlotte caught the subtle scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something darker. Close enough that she saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Ms. Hayes, he said, his voice low and controlled, your efficiency is appreciated. Charlotte nodded professionally, turning to leave. But at the door she paused. Mr. Caldwell? He looked up. It's 62 steps from your desk to our door, not 57. She smiled slightly, in case you ever decide to count again. As she walked back to her office, Charlotte could feel his gaze on her back. She'd just challenged the great Samuel Caldwell, subtly, professionally, but unmistakably, and for the first time since she'd started working for him, she wondered if she was playing with fire. Because understanding his boundaries was one thing, wanting to see what lay behind them was another entirely. The Stonebrook Resort rose from the Massachusetts countryside like an ancient estate transplanted from European nobility. As Samuel's Bentley wound up the tree-lined drive, Charlotte reviewed their schedule on her tablet, hyper-aware of his presence in the seat beside her. 3 days of negotiations for the Boston acquisition, everything planned to perfection. What could possibly go wrong? The answer came in the form of dark clouds gathering on the horizon, much heavier than the forecast had predicted. The Morgan. Team's flight is delayed, Charlotte said, checking her phone. Logan Airport is expecting severe weather. They won't make it until tomorrow morning. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Reschedule the preliminary dinner. We'll use tonight to review the counteroffer. The hotel staff swarmed around them as they entered the grand lobby, but Charlotte had already arranged for separate check-ins. She watched as Samuel was escorted to the East Wing, maintaining his carefully orchestrated bubble of personal space, even as the lobby grew crowded with incoming guests. Her own suite in the West Wing was elegant but practical, exactly what she'd requested. Charlotte changed into a charcoal pencil skirt and cream silk blouse, then headed to Samuel's suite for their evening review session. The mounting storm cast premature darkness across the resort's grounds. Samuel opened the door to his suite before she could knock. He'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, the closest thing to casual she'd ever seen him. The Morgan team sent their revised terms, he said, stepping aside to let her enter, while maintaining his usual distance. They worked efficiently for the next 2 hours, Charlotte taking notes as Samuel dissected every clause of the proposal. Thunder rolled in the distance, growing closer. Their valuation is still too aggressive, Samuel muttered, pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Rain now lashed against the glass. They're overestimating the market recovery. Charlotte watched him move, noting the tension in his shoulders. You're worried about something else, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Samuel stopped pacing, turning to look at her. For a moment the mask slipped, and Charlotte saw genuine surprise in his eyes. Then the lights flickered. Both of their phones chimed simultaneously with emergency alerts. Charlotte read hers first. Severe weather warning. They're advising everyone to stay in place. She looked up at Samuel, whose expression had turned to stone. The resort is implementing emergency protocols. All guests are to remain in their current locations until the storm passes. The implications hung in the air between them. The west wing, where Charlotte's suite was located, was now inaccessible. She was stranded here, with him. Samuel walked to the bar area, his movements rigid. I'll have them prepare another suite in this wing. The alert specifically says to stay in place, Charlotte reminded him. And you know the liability issues if we ignore safety protocols. Another crack of thunder, closer this time. The lights flickered again and went out completely. Emergency generators hummed to life, casting the suite in a dim glow. Samuel stood absolutely still, his silhouette stark against the storm-dark windows. Charlotte could see his mind working, searching for a solution that wouldn't breach his carefully constructed rules. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight. The suite has 2 bedrooms. It does, Charlotte agreed carefully. You'll take the second bedroom. He turned to face her, and in the low light, his expression was almost vulnerable. We maintain professional distance. We work. We wait out the storm. Nothing changes. But something had already changed. Charlotte could feel it in the air between them, in the way Samuel's control seemed more like a thread about to snap than his usual iron wall. I should get my overnight bag from my suite, she said, standing. No. Samuel's response was sharp, then softer. It's not safe to cross the grounds. We'll have the hotel provide whatever you need. Charlotte nodded, hyper-aware of how the emergency lighting cast shadows across his features. I'll call the front desk. She turned away, pulling out her phone, but not before she saw something flicker in Samuel's eyes, something that looked remarkably like fear. Not of the storm, she realized, but of what this night might mean for his carefully constructed world of rules and distance. As she made the call, Charlotte glanced at her reflection in the window. Behind her, Samuel had resumed his pacing, like a caged lion sensing a change in the wind. Outside, the storm raged, trapping them together in this suite with its dimmed lights and charged atmosphere. One night, 2 bedrooms, an impassable distance that suddenly felt paper-thin. Charlotte ended her call with the front desk and turned back to face the room. Samuel had moved to his laptop, his fingers typing with more force than necessary, playing at normalcy. But she knew, as surely as she knew the storm would eventually pass, that nothing about this night would be normal, because rules were made for ordinary circumstances, and there was nothing ordinary about being trapped in a storm-darkened suite, with a man who treated touch like a mortal sin and control like a religion. Should we continue reviewing the proposal? She asked, keeping her voice professionally neutral. Samuel's typing paused. Yes, he said, not looking up. Let's focus on work. But they both knew that focus, like his rules, was about to be tested, in ways neither of them had expected. Hours crept by in the storm-darkened suite. Charlotte had changed into the hotel-provided silk pajamas and robe, painfully aware that even this small domesticity felt like an invasion of the professional bubble she and Samuel normally maintained. They'd abandoned the acquisition paperwork, after the third power flicker made the laptop unreliable. Now Samuel stood at the rain-lashed windows, his white dress shirt ghostly in the emergency lighting. He'd been silent for the past 20 minutes, but Charlotte could practically hear his mind working, processing this unprecedented breach of his carefully structured world. "The hotel left tea," Charlotte said, breaking the silence. She moved to the small kitchenette, maintaining what space she could in the confined area. "Would you like some?" "No." His response was clipped, then softer. "Thank you." Charlotte prepared her own cup, the familiar ritual calming her nerves. Lightning flashed, illuminating the suite in stark white. In that brief moment she caught Samuel watching her reflection in the window. "You have questions," he said suddenly. Charlotte paused, cup halfway to her lips. "Everyone has questions about you, Mr. Caldwell, but you don't ask them." He turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Why?" "Because questions are another form of touch," she said quietly. "They breach boundaries just as surely as a handshake." Something shifted in his stance. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He moved to the seating area, taking the armchair furthest from where she stood. "Ask." Charlotte's heart picked up speed. This was dangerous territory. But the storm had created a strange bubble of unreality, where their normal rules seemed distant and hazy. "Why 57 steps?" she asked, referring to their earlier conversation about his counting. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "My father's age when he died." Charlotte absorbed this, understanding it was more than just a fact. It was a key. "You count other things too?" "Everything." His voice was low, controlled. "Steps, breaths, minutes in meetings, distance between people." "It gives you control," Charlotte said, not a question this time. "Control is survival." Samuel's fingers drummed once on the armrest, then stilled. "When everything else is chaos, numbers remain constant, predictable." Lightning flashed again, and thunder crashed almost immediately overhead. Charlotte jumped slightly, her tea splashing. Without thinking, she moved to the couch nearest Samuel's chair. "What happened?" she asked softly. "What made chaos so threatening?" For a long moment, only the sound of rain filled the suite. Charlotte thought he wouldn't answer. "Then I was 12, he said, his voice distant. "My father was unpredictable. One moment perfect control, the next—" He trailed off, his knuckles white on the armrest. Touch became complicated. A hand on the shoulder could mean approval or warning. You never knew which until it was too late. Charlotte's heart ached. "So you learned to count the steps away, to maintain perfect distance." "Distance is safe," he said. "Numbers don't lie, don't change, don't—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he'd said too much. "Hurt you," Charlotte finished quietly. Samuel's head snapped up, his eyes meeting. Hers with an intensity that stole her breath. For a moment, raw vulnerability crossed his features before being locked away again. "Your turn," he said, his voice rough. "Why did you really leave Reed Enterprises?" Charlotte wrapped her hands around her teacup, absorbing its warmth. "Because the CEO didn't understand boundaries. He thought a corner office gave him the right to everything." Understanding darkened Samuel's expression. "He touched you." "Tried to." Charlotte's smile was bitter. "I broke his finger. The settlement agreement was generous." A strange sound escaped Samuel. Something between a laugh and a growl. "Good." Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, and Charlotte couldn't help but feel it matched the electricity building in the room. "We all have our reasons for the walls we build," she said softly. "Some people's walls keep others out. Some people's walls keep themselves in." "And which am I?" Samuel asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. Charlotte met his gaze steadily. "I think your walls do both. The question is, do they protect you or do they imprison you?" The emergency lights chose that moment to flicker and die, plunging them into near-total darkness. Charlotte heard Samuel's sharp intake of breath, felt the sudden tension radiating from his direction. "I should get more candles from the bedroom," she said, starting to rise. "Stay." The word was hoarse, almost desperate. Then, more controlled. "Please, just stay where you are." Charlotte settled back onto the couch, understanding. In the darkness, with the storm raging outside, his carefully counted steps and measured distances meant nothing. All his systems of control were temporarily useless. "I'm here," she said quietly, 5 feet away, not moving. She heard his breathing, slowly steady, counting the seconds between each inhale. After a moment he spoke again, his voice different, rougher, more real. "Ms. Hayes, Charlotte, I don't know how to do this. Do what? Be in the dark, be uncertain, be—" He paused, and she could hear the internal struggle in his voice. "Be close to someone without counting the steps between us." Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest, matching the storm outside. "Then don't count," she whispered. "Just breathe." The darkness hung between them, heavy with possibility and fear. And somewhere in that darkness, Charlotte heard Samuel Caldwell do something she never expected. He took a deep, uncounted breath. The darkness seemed to breathe with them, intimate and dangerous. Charlotte remained perfectly still on the couch, listening to Samuel's measured breaths from the armchair. The storm continued its assault outside, but in here the atmosphere had shifted to something else entirely, something electric and uncertain. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and Charlotte caught Samuel's expression, raw, unguarded, almost lost. In that brief moment he looked nothing like the controlled CEO who ruled his empire from the 72nd floor. He looked like a man on the edge of either running or falling. "Tell me something real," she said softly into the darkness. "Something you've never told anyone." The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I remember what it felt like before." "Before what?" "Before I learned to count steps. Before distance became safety." His voice was low, almost hypnotic. "I remember my mother's hugs, how they felt like home, not threat. I was 8 when she died. After that—" He trailed off. "That's when your father changed," Charlotte finished, gently. "Grief broke something in him, and he broke something in me." The confession hung in the air between them. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm more like him than I want to admit. Controlling, cold, afraid of feeling anything real." Charlotte's heart ached. "The fact that you worry about it proves you're different." Another lightning flash. This time she saw him leaning forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, head bowed. The perfect posture was gone, replaced by something viscerally human. "Your turn," he said roughly. "Something real." Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the room's warmth. "I understand your rules better than you. Think after Reed, after what his touch threatened to take from me. I created my own distances, professional, perfect, safe." She paused, gathering courage. "But sometimes I catch myself wondering what it would feel like to trust someone's touch again, to want it." The air between them thickened. Charlotte heard Samuel's sharp intake of breath, felt the weight of her confession settle in the darkness. "And do you?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Want it?" Before she could answer, a violent crash of thunder shook the windows. Charlotte startled, a small sound of surprise escaping her. In the same instant she heard Samuel move, quick, unplanned steps across the space between them. "Charlotte." The couch dipped beside her, close but not touching. His voice was tight with concern. "I'm fine," she breathed, her heart racing. For more than just the thunder, just startled. They sat there in the darkness, the closest they'd ever been. Charlotte could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that subtle scent of sandalwood that always lingered in his wake. Every nerve ending in her body was aware of the inches between them, inches that might as well have been miles, for how insurmountable they usually felt. "I can't see the distance," Samuel said, his voice strange and wonderstruck. "I can't count the steps or measure the space. It should terrify me." "Does it?" "Yes." He shifted slightly. "But not for the reasons it should." Charlotte turned toward his voice, though she could barely see him in the darkness. Why does it terrify you? Because for the first time in 15 years, I don't want the distance. His breathing was uneven now, uncounted. Because right now, in the dark, with you, I can't remember why I needed it in the first place. Lightning flashed again, and Charlotte saw his face inches from hers, his eyes dark with something that looked like longing. The thunder that followed felt distant, unimportant. "Samuel," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. She felt, rather than saw him, tense at the intimacy of it. "I don't know how to do this," he repeated his words from earlier, but now they carried a different weight. "I don't know how to want something I've spent years avoiding." Slowly, telegraphing a movement, Charlotte reached out in the darkness. Her hand found his where it rested on the couch between them. Samuel's sharp inhale filled the space between them, but he didn't pull away. "Then don't think," she whispered. "Don't count, don't measure, just feel." His hand trembled beneath hers, but then, slowly, his fingers intertwined with hers. The simple touch felt more intimate than any kiss Charlotte had ever known. "Your heart is racing," he murmured, and she realized he could feel her pulse where their hands joined. "So is yours." Samuel's other hand found her face in the darkness, his fingers trembling as they traced her cheekbone. The touch was feather-light, as if he was afraid she might shatter, or he might. "Charlotte." He breathed her name like a prayer or a surrender. She turned her face into his palm, feeling him shudder at the deliberate contact. "Yes?" Instead of answering, he closed the final distance between them. His lips found hers in the darkness, soft and uncertain at first, then with growing desperation. Charlotte felt years of control and distance crumbling in that kiss, felt the exact moment when counting steps and measuring spaces became meaningless. Samuel pulled her closer, his hands tangling in her hair, and Charlotte knew they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Tomorrow, in the light, there would be consequences. Tomorrow there would be rules to reckon with and walls to rebuild. But tonight, in the storm-dark suite, with thunder rolling overhead and lightning painting shadows on the walls, Samuel Caldwell finally stopped counting and started feeling. And for the first time in 15 years, the touch of another person felt like coming home. Dawn broke over the Stonebrook Resort, painting the storm-washed grounds in pale gold. Charlotte stood at the window of the second bedroom, watching workers clear fallen branches from the paths below. Her fingers absently traced her lips, still feeling the ghost of last night's kisses. The suite's main room was silent. Samuel had retreated to his bedroom hours ago, after their passionate encounter had finally broken under the weight of reality. The last thing he'd said was a hoarse, "Good night, Ms. Hayes," a jarring return to formality that told her everything about what morning would bring. She checked her appearance in the mirror, fresh clothes provided by the hotel, hair neat, makeup perfect. Professional armor for what she knew would be a professional battlefield. When she entered the main room, Samuel was already there, impeccable in a fresh suit. He stood at his usual spot by the windows, his back rigid with tension. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," Charlotte said, keeping her voice steady. "The Morgan team's flight has been rescheduled for noon. They'll be here in time for the main negotiations." Samuel didn't turn. "Have the conference room prepared. All documentation in order, already done." Charlotte moved to the coffee maker, maintaining careful distance. "Would you like coffee?" "No." His voice was cold, controlled. Everything last night's voice hadn't been. "That will be all, Miss Hayes." Charlotte's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "Are we not going to discuss what happened?" Nothing happened. The words fell like ice between them. Last night was a temporary lapse in judgment, one that will not be repeated. A lapse in judgment, Charlotte repeated softly. Is that what you call letting yourself feel something real for once? Samuel turned then, his face a mask of careful indifference. But Charlotte saw the strain around his eyes, the way his hands clenched at his sides. What I feel or don't feel is irrelevant. We have a professional relationship, one that I intend to maintain. Professional? Charlotte said, a trace of bitterness creeping into her voice. Like counting steps and sanitizing away handshakes? Tell me, Samuel, how many times have you washed your hands this morning, trying to erase the memory of touching me? His mask slipped for just a moment, raw pain flashing across his features. Don't. Don't what? Don't remind you that for one night you were actually human, that you stopped counting and started living? Enough! Samuel's voice cracked like a whip. He strode to his laptop, fingers gripping the edge of the desk. I am your employer, Ms. Hayes. Nothing more. Last night was a mistake brought on by unusual circumstances, one that will not affect our working relationship. Charlotte walked toward him, deliberate steps that she knew he was counting. Look at me. Ms. Hayes. Look at me, Samuel. Slowly, reluctantly he turned. Their eyes met, and Charlotte saw the war raging behind his careful facade, desire warring with fear, need battling control. Tell me you didn't feel it, she challenged softly. Tell me that when you kissed me, when you finally let yourself, and touched someone without fear, it didn't feel like breaking free. Samuel's breath hitched. For a moment she thought she saw his walls crumbling again. Then his expression hardened. What I felt was weakness, one I won't indulge again. He straightened his tie, a nervous tell she'd never noticed before. The Morgan team will be here in 4 hours. I suggest you focus on your actual duties. Charlotte felt the dismissal like a physical blow. She stepped back, professional mask sliding back into place. Of course, Mr. Caldwell. I'll have everything ready. She turned to leave, but at the door she paused. You know what the saddest part is? You're so afraid of becoming your father that you've become something worse, a man who's not only afraid to hurt others, but afraid to love them too. The sharp intake of breath behind her told her the words had hit home. But she didn't turn back, couldn't bear to see if they'd cracked his armor or just made him build it higher. As she walked to her temporary office down the hall, Charlotte felt the weight of unshed tears behind her eyes. She'd known this would happen, had seen it coming even as she'd surrendered to the magic of last night. Samuel Caldwell didn't break rules, he enforced them, and she had just become his most dangerous violation. But even as she settled into work mode, preparing for the day ahead, one thought kept circling in her mind. She had felt his hands shake when he touched her, had tasted the desperation in his kiss, had seen, for one brief, shining moment, the man he could be if he ever stopped being afraid. That man was still in there, buried beneath layers of control and counting steps. And despite everything her screaming to protect her own heart, Charlotte knew she wasn't ready to give up on him. Not yet. Not when she knew what it felt like to be the one who made Samuel Caldwell finally lose count. 6 weeks after the storm at Stonebrook Resort, Charlotte sat at her desk in the Caldwell Tower, watching the sun set over the city. The Morgan acquisition had closed successfully, adding another victory to Samuel's empire. Everything was back to normal, except nothing was normal at all. Where there had once been a careful professional dance between them, there was now an Arctic wasteland. Samuel had doubled down on his rules, creating new distances Charlotte hadn't even known could exist. He communicated primarily through email, scheduled video calls instead of in-person meetings, and on the rare occasions when they had to be in the same room, he positioned himself as far from her as physically possible. It would have been easier if she could hate him for it, but she'd seen too much of the pain behind his walls to manage hatred. The first wave of nausea hit without warning. Charlotte grabbed her desk, breathing deeply until it passed. This had been happening more frequently over the past week, a fact she'd been steadfastly ignoring. Her phone buzzed with an email from Samuel. "Ms. Hayes, the Beijing investors require documentation for their due diligence. Please have it compiled by morning. S. Caldwell." Charlotte stared at the formal tone, remembering how her name had sounded on his lips that night. Soft, reverent, real. Another wave of nausea rolled through her, stronger this time. "No," she whispered to her empty office. "No, no, no." But her body was already doing the math her mind didn't want to face. 6 weeks, missed period. Morning sickness that didn't care what time of day it was. She grabbed her purse, hands shaking. "Clara," she called to Samuel's secretary as she passed, "I'm not feeling well. I'll finish the documentation from home." The pharmacy near her apartment was fluorescent, bright and empty. Charlotte stood in front of the pregnancy tests, her professional composure cracking. She bought 3 different brands and a bottle of ginger ale for her roiling stomach. In her bathroom at home, she lined up the tests like soldiers facing a firing squad. 3 tests, 5 minutes each, an eternity of waiting. Her phone buzzed. Again. "Samuel, Ms. Hayes, your abrupt departure was noted. If you are unable to perform your duties..." She didn't read the rest. Instead, she stared at the first test as the result window changed. Positive. With trembling fingers, she checked the second test. Positive. The third test seemed to take forever, but when the lines appeared, they were unmistakable. Positive. Charlotte sank to the bathroom floor, her back against the cool tile wall. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Samuel Caldwell's child, the man who couldn't bear to be in the same room with her, who had retreated so far into his fortress of rules that she doubted he even remembered how her touch had made him tremble. Her hand drifted to her still flat stomach. In the harsh bathroom, light, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Pale, shocked, but somehow already different. There was life growing inside her. Lives, she would soon discover, but for now the simple fact of pregnancy was overwhelming enough. Her phone buzzed again, and again. Samuel, demanding a response about the documentation, about her departure, about her continued usefulness as an employee. Each message more formal than the last, as if he could erase what had happened between them through sheer professional distance. "Mr. Caldwell." Her fingers hovered over the keys. She could tell him. Should tell him. He had a right to know. But then she remembered his words from that morning after. Nothing happened, a temporary lapse in judgment. How would a man who denied their night together handle the news that it had created a permanent consequence? A man who measured his life in counted steps and careful distances, who saw emotional connection as weakness and touch as a threat. The Beijing documentation still needed to be compiled. The work would take hours. She could do it now, send it to him, maintain the professional facade he so desperately needed. Or... Charlotte looked at the tests again, those 3 undeniable positives that had just changed everything. Then she opened a new email. "Mr. Caldwell, please accept this as my 2 weeks' notice of resignation. Charlotte Hayes." She hit send before. She could change her mind. Then she blocked his number, his email, every digital pathway he had to reach her. Tomorrow, she would have her doctor confirm what the tests had already told her. She would start making plans, looking for a new job, building a life that could hold space for the child growing inside her. But tonight, she curled up on her bathroom floor and finally let the tears come. For the baby who would never know their father's touch, for the man who was too broken to love either of them, and for herself, because despite everything, a part of her still remembered how it felt to be the one person Samuel Caldwell had trusted enough to let close. Her phone lit up with one final email before the blocks took effect. "Ms. Hayes, resignation." Not accepted. Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. S. Caldwell. Charlotte deleted it without replying. She'd broken once, letting herself believe that the man behind the walls could change. She wouldn't break again. She had someone else to protect now. Samuel Caldwell stood in his empty office at 8:57 a.m., staring at Charlotte's vacant desk through the glass partition. For the first time in his professional life, someone had defied a direct order. She wasn't coming to the 9 a.m. meeting. She wasn't coming at all. His fingers drummed against his thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stop. Repeat. A habit from childhood that emerged when control slipped away. "Clara!" he called through the intercom. "Get me Ms. Hayes's personnel file and her emergency contact information." "Sir." Clara's voice was hesitant. "Ms. Hayes submitted her resignation through HR this morning. They've already processed the file, Clara, now." 10 minutes later, he sat at his desk, scanning Charlotte's details. Her address was useless. He'd already sent someone to her apartment, only to find she'd left hours ago. Her emergency contact was a cousin in Seattle. Dead end. Samuel opened his laptop, pulling up the building's security footage from yesterday. There, Charlotte leaving abruptly, her face pale. He leaned closer, noting how she'd pressed a hand to her stomach before hurrying to the elevator. Something cold settled in his chest, a suspicion he didn't want to acknowledge. "Clara, get me Dr. Morrison's office." His personal physician answered. On the second ring, "Mr. Caldwell, is everything all right? I need information about a patient, Charlotte Hayes." "Sir, you know I can't. She's my employee, and there are concerns about liability." The lie tasted bitter. "I need to know if she's been treated recently." "Mr. Caldwell, even if she were my patient, which I cannot confirm or deny, medical privacy laws, she was seen yesterday, looking ill." A pause. Then, "I really cannot discuss any patient's condition, including whether or not they might be in a delicate condition." Samuel's hand clenched on the phone. The doctor's careful wording told him everything. "Thank you, doctor. That will be all." He stood, moving to the windows where he'd first interviewed Charlotte, where she'd seen through his walls before. He'd even realized they were transparent to her. Pregnant, the word echoed in his mind, shattering his carefully ordered thoughts. If she'd been ill yesterday, looking pale, rushing out, she must have just found out. And her immediate response had been to run from him, from them, from what had happened that night at Stonebrook, because you gave her no choice, a voice in his head whispered. You pushed her away so hard she had nowhere else to go. "Clara," his voice was hoarse, "cancel my meetings for the day, and get me everything you can find on Charlotte Hayes, where she might go, who she might turn to." "Sir." Clara appeared in his doorway, concern evident on her face. "Is Miss Hayes in some kind of trouble?" Samuel stared at his reflection in the window. Immaculate suit, perfect posture, absolute control, except his hands were shaking. "No," he said quietly, "but I am." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of private investigators and dead ends. Charlotte had vanished completely. Her apartment was empty, her phone disconnected, her email returning automatic responses. She'd even closed her social media accounts. On the third day, Samuel sat in his home office, surrounded by reports that told him nothing useful. His usual evening scotch sat untouched on his desk. The house phone rang, the private line only his most trusted associates had access to. "Caldwell!" "Samuel." The voice was familiar. William Hayes, one of his board members. No relation to Charlotte, or so he'd thought. "We need to talk about my niece." Samuel's breath caught. "You're Charlotte's uncle." "Yes, and while I respect your privacy and hers, this situation requires intervention." "Where is she?" "Safe." William's tone was careful. and determined to stay that way. She's carrying my child. Children, William corrected quietly. Twins, according to her first ultrasound. The scotch glass shattered in Samuel's hand. He barely felt the sting of glass and alcohol in the cuts. I need to see her. The words came out raw, stripped, of all pretense. Do you? William's voice hardened. The same way you needed to see her for the past 6 weeks. The same way you needed to treat her like a pariah after what happened between you. That's not, she told me everything, Samuel. About Stonebrook, about how you shut down completely afterward, about your rules and your walls and your carefully measured distances. A pause. About how you made her feel when she got closest to the real you and how you punished her for it afterward. Samuel closed his eyes, blood dripping unnoticed from his hand. I didn't know how to, I couldn't handle feeling something real, William finished. Well, now you have something very real to handle. 2 lives that are half yours, being carried by a woman who would rather disappear than watch you reject them the way you rejected her. I wouldn't you? William's voice was soft now, almost pitying. Can you honestly tell me you're ready to be a father? To hold those babies? To touch them, love them, let them close enough to hurt you? Samuel looked down at his bleeding hand, at the shattered glass that had once represented perfect control. I don't know, he whispered, but I need to try. A long silence followed. Finally, William spoke. She's at my lake house in Vermont, but Samuel, if you go to her, be very sure about what you want, because if you hurt her again, if you let your fears hurt those babies, I will make sure you never find them again. The line went dead. Samuel sat in his darkening office, blood drying on his hand, control lying in pieces around him like the shattered Scotch glass. For the first time since that night at Stonebrook, he let himself remember how it felt to hold Charlotte, to kiss her, to stop counting steps and start feeling life. Now there was more life. 2 tiny lives growing inside the woman who had seen through every wall he'd built. He stood, decision made. He couldn't promise he knew how to be a father, couldn't promise he wouldn't be terrified of every touch, every emotion, every moment, of vulnerability that children would demand of him. But he could promise to try, to learn, to face his fears instead of running from them, because some things were worth breaking rules for, even if those rules had kept you safe for 15 years. Vermont in early autumn painted the world in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel's Bentley wound through lanes of falling leaves, each turn bringing him closer to the lake house and to Charlotte. His bandaged hand gripped the steering wheel, the cuts a constant reminder of control already broken. The house appeared through the trees, sprawling and elegant, with a wraparound porch facing the water. And there, sitting on the porch steps with a book in her lap, was Charlotte. Samuel's heart stopped, then started again with painful force. Even from this distance, he could see the changes in her. The subtle roundness to her face, the protective way her hand rested on her stomach, the wariness that entered her posture as she recognized his car. He parked and stepped out, maintaining distance, an old habit he couldn't quite break. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the leaf-strewn driveway. "Uncle William called," Charlotte said finally, her voice carrying clearly. "In the autumn air. He warned me you were coming. Are you—" Samuel stopped, recalibrated. "How are you feeling?" "Better. The morning sickness is starting to ease." Her hand moved slightly on her stomach, though having 2 of them in here doesn't help. Twins. The word still hit him like a physical blow. "May I—" He gestured to the steps where she sat. Charlotte nodded but didn't move to make room. He would have to come to her, cross the distance himself. It was a test, he realized, one he couldn't afford to fail. Samuel walked forward, counting steps automatically before forcing himself to stop. 23. Steps brought him to the bottom of the porch stairs. He made himself climb them, made himself sit beside her, close enough to touch, though he didn't. "You're bleeding," Charlotte said quietly. Samuel looked down. A spot of red had seeped through the bandage on his hand. "It's nothing." "Since when does Samuel Caldwell say anything is nothing?" Her voice held an edge of bitterness. "Everything has to mean something with you. Every step counted, every distance measured, every touch." She broke off, pain flashing across her features. "Charlotte," his voice was rough, "I'm sorry." "For what? For that night? For shutting me out afterward? For making me feel like I'd done something wrong by making you feel something real?" She turned to face him fully. "Or are you sorry I'm carrying the proof that you're human after all?" The words hit like slaps, each one deserved. For all of it, for not knowing how to what, Samuel? How to treat me like a person instead of a threat? How to handle the fact that for one night you actually let yourself live instead of just exist? How to love you? The words burst from him, raw and unexpected. "I don't know how to love you, how to love them." His gesture encompassed her stomach, the twins growing inside. "I don't know how to be anything except what I've made myself into. This controlled, distant, broken thing that can't even—" He broke off, running his uninjured hand through his hair, a gesture so unlike his usual precision that Charlotte's breath caught. "Show me your hand," she said suddenly. Samuel blinked. "What?" "Your hand. The injured one. Show me." Slowly he held out his bandaged hand. Charlotte took it gently, and the simple touch sent electricity through him. Carefully, she unwrapped the bandage, revealing the cuts from the broken glass. "What happened?" "I broke a scotch glass when your uncle told me about the twins." Charlotte's fingers traced the edges of the cuts, and Samuel forced himself not to pull away. "Did you clean these properly?" No. I came straight here." The great Samuel Caldwell, leaving something untended? Her voice was soft, but he heard the question beneath it. Why? "Because some things matter more than perfect control." He made himself meet her eyes. "You matter more." Charlotte's hands stilled on his. Don't say things like that unless you mean them, unless you're ready to actually change." "I don't know if I can change everything I am," Samuel admitted. "The counting, the distance. It's been my safety for so long, but I want to try. For you, for them." "Why? Because you feel obligated? Because that night at Stonebrook wasn't just a lapse in judgment?" The words came faster now, urgent. "It was the first time in 15 years I felt alive, really alive, and I've been terrified of that feeling ever since, terrified of how much I wanted it, wanted you." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "You pushed me away." "Because wanting someone that much, needing someone, it goes against everything I built myself to be. But these past weeks without you—" He swallowed hard. "I've been counting every second, every breath, trying to maintain control while my whole world falls apart, and now—" His free hand moved, hovering over her stomach before pulling back. Charlotte caught it, pressed it gently to the slight swell of her belly. "Now there are 2 more lives to count," she finished softly. Samuel's breath hitched at the contact, at the knowledge that beneath his palm his daughters were growing. "No," he whispered. "Now there are 2 more reasons to stop counting altogether." A tear slipped down Charlotte's cheek. "I can't trust that. Not yet. Not after how easily you shut down last time." "I know." Samuel kept his hand where it was, fighting every instinct to pull away. "I know I hurt you. No, I don't deserve a second chance. But Charlotte," his voice broke, "I want to learn, to be better, to be someone worthy of you, of them." "And what happens when it gets hard? When the babies come and they need touch?" Need love, need a father who can hold them without counting the seconds until he can let go. The question hit him like a knife to the heart because it was his deepest fear given voice. But for once, Samuel didn't retreat from the pain. "Then I learn," he said simply, "every day, every moment, until holding them feels like breathing, until loving them, loving you, feels like the most natural thing in the world." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of the mask he usually wore. But it was gone, shattered like the Scotch glass that had cut his hand. All that remained was raw honesty and desperate hope. "I can't promise it will be easy," she said finally. "Having these babies, learning to trust each other, I don't want easy." Samuel's thumb moved slightly against her stomach, his first voluntary caress. "I want real." Another tear fell. Charlotte brushed it away with her free hand. "Then prove it," she whispered. "Stay. Not just today. Stay and face every fear with me. Learn to love without counting the cost." Samuel leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm done counting," he breathed against her lips. "Done measuring. Done hiding." His hand spread wider on her stomach, protective and possessive at once. "I choose this. Choose you. Choose them, no matter how terrifying it is." And when Charlotte finally kissed him, soft and sweet and full of cautious hope, Samuel Caldwell did something he'd never done before. He lost count completely. 2 months passed like autumn leaves drifting on the lake's surface. Charlotte had moved back to the city, but not to her old apartment. Instead, she'd taken a suite at the St. Regis, Samuel's careful compromise between giving her independence and keeping her close. The whispers at Caldwell Tower had slowly died down. Charlotte's return as a consultant rather than an assistant helped maintain professional boundaries, though everyone noticed the changes in Samuel. The way he'd stopped requiring 6 feet of space in meetings, the way his hand sanitizer had disappeared from his desk, the way he actually smiled sometimes. Today, they sat in a private waiting room at Dr. Morrison's office, waiting for Charlotte's 20-week scan. Samuel's leg bounced slightly, a new nervous tell that had emerged as his rigid control had begun to fade. "They're going to be fine," Charlotte assured him, placing her hand over his. "I know." But his fingers laced through hers, holding on. I want to see them." The ultrasound room was dimly lit, intimate. Samuel stood beside the examination table, still holding Charlotte's hand, as Dr. Morrison applied the gel to her now prominent belly. "All right," the doctor said warmly. "Let's check on your daughters." The image flickered to life on the screen. 2 distinct shapes, 2 beating hearts. Samuel's grip tightened as Dr. Morrison pointed out features. Tiny fingers, delicate spines, perfect profiles. "Baby A is here," the doctor indicated, "and baby B—" "Oh, what?" Samuel's voice was sharp with concern. "What's wrong?" Nothing's wrong," Dr. Morrison smiled. "Baby B is sucking her thumb." Charlotte felt Samuel's sharp intake of breath. She looked up to see him staring at the screen, something like wonder breaking through his usual reserve. "They're real," he whispered. "They've always been real," Charlotte said softly. "No, I mean—" He swallowed hard. "They're people. Tiny, perfect people, and one of them is sucking her thumb." The vulnerability in his voice made Charlotte's heart ache. This was the Samuel few people ever saw, the one who felt things so deeply he'd spent years building walls to contain it all. Later, over dinner in his penthouse, Samuel spread the ultrasound photos across his usually immaculate desk. "We need to discuss names," he said, tracing one baby's profile with a gentle finger. "We do." Charlotte watched him from her position on the leather couch. "Any thoughts?" He hesitated. "I'd like to name one of them after my mother. If that's all right." Charlotte sat up straighter. In all their time together, he'd never voluntarily mentioned his mother. What was her name? Lily. His voice softened on the word. She loved gardens. Always said her own mother naming her after a flower was what gave her the passion for it. Lily, Charlotte tested the name. It's beautiful. What about her sister? Samuel looked up, something vulnerable in his expression. What was your mother's name? Charlotte's breath caught. Rose. A smile touched his lips, real, unguarded. Lily and Rose, our own little garden. You don't think it's too matched? I think it's perfect. He moved to sit beside her on the couch. Another change, this easy physical proximity. Two flowers that grew through concrete, like their mother. Charlotte leaned into him, feeling his arm settle around her shoulders. Using metaphors now? Who are you and what have you done with Samuel Caldwell? I'm learning, he said quietly. Every day. His free hand came to rest on her belly, where their daughters grew. Sometimes I still count things. Steps, breaths, minutes. But now I'm counting towards something instead of away from it. What do you mean? Before, I counted to maintain distance, to keep everything and everyone at a safe remove. His thumb stroked gently over her stomach. Now I count the weeks until we meet them, the times I feel them kick, the moments when being close to you feels more natural than being apart. Charlotte turned to look at him. And how many moments is that? More every day. He kissed her softly. Soon I might lose count entirely. They sat in comfortable silence, his hands still moving in gentle circles over their growing daughters. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the building, renovation work continued on what would soon be a nursery, pale pink and cream, with a garden mural Charlotte had specially commissioned. I have something to show. You, Samuel said suddenly. He stood, offering her his hand. In the nursery. Charlotte let him lead her down the hall to the room that was slowly transforming from his former home office into a space for their daughters. The walls were prepped for painting, the furniture was due to arrive next week, but in the center of the room stood something unexpected, a rocking chair. Not just any rocking chair, an antique piece, lovingly restored with delicate roses, carved into the wood. It was my mother's, Samuel said softly. She used to rock me in it, sing to me. After she died, my father, he put everything of hers in storage. I hadn't looked at any of it until last week. Charlotte ran her hand over the smooth wood. It's beautiful. There's more. He opened a cabinet in the corner, pulling out a small, worn book. Her garden, diary. She pressed flowers in it, wrote about what each bloom meant. He opened it carefully, showing her dried petals between yellowed pages. Lilies for purity of heart, roses for enduring love. Samuel. Charlotte felt tears threatening. I want them to know her, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Through this chair, these flowers, the names we give them, I want them to know the love I knew before. He stopped, collecting himself. Before I forgot how to love at all. Charlotte stepped into his arms, feeling them close around her immediately. No hesitation now, no counted seconds before contact. They'll know love, she whispered against his chest. Because you remember now. Because you're choosing it every day. Samuel's hand came to rest between them, where their daughters kicked and moved. They're teaching me, he admitted. Every time I see them on a scan, feel them move, hear their heartbeats. They're teaching me that some things are worth the risk of feeling everything. Charlotte looked up at him, seeing the man she'd glimpsed that night at Stonebrook, but stronger now, more real. A man learning to balance control with surrender, fear with love. We all are, she said softly, learning together. And as Samuel held her in their daughter's future nursery, surrounded by symbols of past love and future hope, Charlotte realized something profound. Sometimes the strongest people aren't those who never break, but those who learn to put themselves back together differently, better, stronger, just like the flowers their daughters would be named for, breaking through concrete to reach the sun. At 34 weeks pregnant, Charlotte woke to sharp pain and fear. The twins weren't due for another month. It was too soon, far too soon. Samuel found her doubled over in the bathroom of their newly shared penthouse, one hand clutched to her swollen belly, the other gripping the marble counter. "Something's wrong," she gasped. For one terrible moment, Samuel froze. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't in their carefully laid plans. This wasn't... Charlotte's cry of pain shattered his paralysis. "I'm here," he said, moving to her. Sighed. "I've got you." His arm went around her waist, supporting her weight. No hesitation, no counting steps, just pure instinct. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights, and Charlotte's labored breathing. Samuel's hands clenched the steering wheel, his mind racing through statistics about premature twins, complications, survival rates. "Stop," Charlotte whispered from the passenger seat. "I can hear you counting risks in your head." "I can't help it." His voice was tight. "I need to be prepared, need to know what to expect, need to be here, now, with me." She reached for his hand. "They need their father present, not perfect." The words hit home just as they reached the hospital. Dr. Morrison was already waiting, alerted by Samuel's calls. "Preterm labor," she announced after examining Charlotte. "We need to stop it. The next 24 hours are critical." Samuel stood by Charlotte's bed as nurses hooked up monitors and IVs. The steady beep of 3 heartbeat monitors filled the room. Charlotte's and their daughters. "Mr. Caldwell?" Dr. Morrison touched his arm, and for once he didn't flinch from unexpected contact. "A word outside?" In the hallway, the doctor's expression was grave. "The medication should help, but there are no guarantees. If we can't stop the labor," she paused, "the babies would have a fighting chance, but they'd need intensive care. Weeks, maybe months, in the NICU. And there are risks." "Tell me." His voice was raw. "All of them." She did. Each possibility, each complication, each potential outcome. Samuel absorbed them all, his old habit of counting giving him something to cling to, numbers, statistics, probabilities. But when he returned to Charlotte's room, he forced himself to focus on what was real. The soft beeping of heartbeats, the way Charlotte's hand reached for his, the flutter of movement under his palm when he touched her belly. "Tell me a story," Charlotte said suddenly, her voice strained with effort to stay still, to let the medications work. "What?" "A story about your mother, about the garden she loved, about anything except what might go wrong." Samuel swallowed hard. Stories meant emotion, meant remembering, meant feeling. But Charlotte needed this. Their daughters needed this. "She had a rose garden," he began softly. "Every variety you could imagine. But her favorites were the wild ones, the ones that grew however they wanted, reaching for the sun in their own way." His thumb stroked Charlotte's hand as he spoke. "She used to tell me that gardens teach us the most important lesson in life, that you can't control everything. You can only nurture, support, and love what grows." "She sounds wise," Charlotte murmured. She was. Samuel felt tears threatening, something that would have terrified him months ago. Now he let them come. "When she died, my father tried to control everything. Every emotion, every memory, every moment of grief. He turned it all into rules and distance and counting steps away from pain. And you learned from him. I became him." Samuel's free hand moved to Charlotte's belly, feeling their daughters shift beneath his touch. "Until you, until them, until I realized that counting steps away from love is just another way of counting steps away from living." Hours passed. Samuel talked more than he had in years. telling stories about his mother's garden, about the first time he'd helped her plant seeds, about the way she'd taught him that beautiful things take time to grow. Dawn was breaking when Dr. Morrison returned, checking readings and monitors. "The medications are working," she announced with a smile. "The contractions have stopped, but Charlotte, you'll need complete bed rest until delivery. No exceptions." Relief made Samuel's knees weak. He sat heavily in the chair by Charlotte's bed, still holding her hand. "We'll keep you here for observation. For 48 hours, Dr. Morrison continued. "Then, if everything remains stable, you can go home, but you'll need constant care." "I'll arrange for the best nurses," Samuel began. "No." Charlotte's voice was firm. "I need you." Samuel looked at her, understanding the magnitude of what she was asking. Not just practical support, but emotional presence, hours of unstructured time together. No hiding behind work or schedules or carefully maintained distances. "I'll work from home," he said, the decision immediate and unshakable. "Clara can handle anything that needs physical presence at the office." Dr. Morrison smiled. "I'll start. The discharge paperwork. Try to rest, both of you." When they were alone, Charlotte turned to Samuel. "Are you sure about working from home? About all of this?" Samuel leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "Do you know what I was counting these past hours?" "What?" "Heartbeats, yours and theirs, not to maintain control, not to keep distance, but because each one was a miracle. Each one meant you were all still fighting, still growing, still teaching me how to live instead of just exist." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "You've come so far. We have further to go." He kissed her softly. "But I'm done measuring the distance, done counting steps. From now on, I only want to count moments with you, with them. Even the scary ones. Especially those." His hand spread protectively over her belly. "Because they're ours, all of them. The planned and unplanned, the controlled and chaotic, the perfect and imperfect." As if in response, one of the babies kicked against his palm, then the other. Samuel smiled, a full, real smile that transformed his entire face. "Our little garden," he whispered, "growing wild and beautiful, just like their grandmother's roses." And for the first time since that terrifying moment in the bathroom, Charlotte relaxed completely, because she knew, with absolute certainty, that Samuel had finally learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the most powerful form of control is knowing when to let go. The next 4 weeks transformed the penthouse into a different world. Samuel's home office became a command center for both business and baby preparation. His laptop shared space with parenting books, his usual market reports mixed with birthing plans and pediatrician profiles. Charlotte watched the change from her prescribed position on bed rest, marveling at how naturally Samuel had adapted. He took calls while folding tiny onesies, reviewed contracts during breathing practice sessions, and somehow managed to run his empire without missing a single doctor's appointment. But it was the small moments that showed how far he'd come. The way he'd absently rub her feet while reading reports. How he'd press kisses to her belly between meetings. The night she found him in the nursery, fast asleep in his mother's rocking chair, his hand resting on the crib where their daughters would soon sleep. At 38 weeks, right on schedule, Charlotte's water broke. "It's time," she said, watching Samuel's eyes widen with recognition. This time, there was no freezing, no counting risks. He moved with calm purpose, helping her to the car, making necessary calls, maintaining the steady presence she needed. The delivery room was prepared exactly as they'd planned. Dr. Morrison waited with her team, everything ready for the twins' arrival. But birth, like love, doesn't follow rules or schedules. "Baby A is breached, Doctor," Morrison announced after checking Charlotte's progress. "We need to do a C-section." Samuel's hand tightened on Charlotte's, but his voice was steady. "Whatever's safest." Everything moved quickly after that. Charlotte watched Samuel don surgical scrubs, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he tied the mask. "Stay with me," she whispered, as they wheeled her into the operating room. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. Always. The surgery was a blur of sensation and sound. Charlotte felt pressure but no pain, her awareness focused on Samuel's hand in hers and the doctor's quiet efficiency. Then, at 3:47 p.m., a cry pierced the air. "Here's your first daughter," Dr. Morrison announced, lifting a tiny, perfect being into view. Samuel's breath caught. "Lily," he whispered, and Charlotte heard tears in his voice. 2 minutes later, at 3:49 p.m., Rose joined, her sister, announcing her arrival with an equally impressive cry. "They're beautiful," Charlotte said through her own tears, watching as the nurses cleaned and measured their daughters. "They're miracles," Samuel corrected softly. Then, to everyone's surprise, he asked, Can I hold them?" The nurses brought their swaddled daughters over. Samuel sat beside Charlotte's head, and with hands that didn't shake at all, took both twins into his arms. "Hello, my darlings," he murmured, and Charlotte saw the last of his walls crumble completely. "I'm your father, and I've been waiting my whole life to hold you." Later, in the private room filled with flowers from well-wishers, Samuel sat in a chair pulled close to Charlotte's bed. Lily slept in his arms while Rose nursed contentedly. "Do you know what I realized?" he said softly, careful not to wake Lily. "What's that?" "I haven't counted a single thing today, not steps or breaths or minutes." He looked down at Lily's peaceful face. "For the first time in my life, I'm just here, present, living every moment as it comes." Charlotte smiled, stroking Rose's cheek. "And how does it feel?" "Terrifying." He gave a quiet laugh. "Wonderful. Real." His eyes met hers. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing through my walls. For not giving up when I pushed you away. For giving me these perfect little beings who are going to turn my controlled world completely upside down. Are you ready for that?" Samuel looked down at Lily, then at Rose, then back at Charlotte. In his eyes was a warmth that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "I'm ready for everything," he said. "The sleepless nights and messy days, the first steps and skinned knees, the moments when they'll need their father to be strong, and the moments when they'll teach me that strength sometimes means letting go of control." As if on cue, Lily stirred in his arms, her tiny hand escaping her swaddle to grasp his finger. Samuel didn't tense or pull away. Instead, he brought her hand to his lips, kissing it softly. "My mother's garden diary had one last entry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something I found last week. She wrote that the most beautiful gardens are the ones that grow wild and free, where love is the only rule that matters." Charlotte felt tears spring to her eyes. She was right. She was. Samuel stood carefully, moving to sit on the edge of Charlotte's bed, their little family complete and connected. "And so were you that night at Stonebrook. Sometimes the rules we make to protect ourselves are the very things that keep us from truly living." Rose finished nursing, her eyes drifting closed like her sister's. In the quiet of the room, with their daughters sleeping between them, Charlotte saw the future unfold like petals opening to the sun. Messy and beautiful, challenging and rewarding, but most of all, real. "I love you," Samuel said, the words coming naturally now, unplanned and uncounted. "All of you, beyond measure." And in that moment, surrounded by their sleeping daughters, named for flowers that broke through concrete to reach the light, Charlotte and Samuel shared a truth that had been growing since that storm-dark night at Stonebrook. Sometimes the greatest Love stories aren't about finding someone who follows all your rules. They're about finding someone who makes you brave enough to break them. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.